thank you all for joining. We have 2 online, is that correct? And we have a panel here. So we'll start, for technical reasons, we'll start with those joining us online. If you can give a quick intro of your background and also your general understandings of your approach to this I suppose, process of implementing digital biomarkers going forward. So who do we have online? I don't have the titles. One of you, if you can hear me online, please go ahead and introduce yourself. I don't have your names underneath.
We have Roosbeth and Carrie.
I can hear you. It's just
Great. Okay. Carrie, do you want to go first?
Yes.
Great.
I'm sorry. I think you asked me to go first, so I will start.
Yes, thanks, Carrie.
Sorry, you echo. I'm Carrie Northcott. I am a senior director and project lead at Pfizer within digital medicine and translational imaging and early clinical development. I've been working approximately 5 years within the space of digital medicine, really looking to see if we can use a device of some form to digitally measure nocturnal scratch and sleep. So I've been leading this team with everything from development, methodology, validation, to deployment in clinical trials, and really starting to understand how we can use this device. Thank you for the invitation to speak today.
Thank you. And Roosevelt?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruz Ghaffari. I'm CEO of Epicor Biosystems. It's a real pleasure to be presenting, although remote, really good set of sessions, and looking forward to this panel. My background is mostly on the biosensor side at Epicor, and even prior to that, developed various classes of wearable biosensors that are used to interface on the body for tracking physiological biomarkers, phenotypes, as well as more recently at Epicor, we've been developing devices that could tap into the underpinning metabolic and biochemical measures. And we've been developing and deploying these tools in both the context of measuring hydration as well as more stress and nutrition-based markers. So really tapping into a new set of underserved areas within the toolkits that we're developing as a field.
Great, thank you. And Carrie? Sorry.
Kate, I go ahead. I'm a full professor of computer science. I'm leading quality of life technologies lab at the University of Geneva. And we are leveraging off-the-shelf wearable sensors towards quantifying quality of life. And by means of this, we're looking into functioning, physiology functioning, physical functioning, psychological functioning, social functioning, environmental, and we follow World Health Organization model and 24 variables. And we are doing research and actually developing digital biomarkers, which before that was more like algorithms, multimodal machine learning, all there's some keywords, health informatics, and looking into how to quantify in daily life mobility, physical health, stress, use of transportation, self-esteem, you name it. Thank you very much for this invitation.
Thanks, Kate. Apologies for pronunciation. You prefer Kate, right? Okay. And Matteo.
Hi. Welcome. Thanks, everybody, for having us. So, Matteo, I'm CEO and co-founder of Empatica. We develop primarily digital biomarkers, surprisingly, in the looking at the conference, but we also develop sensors and software to support the development. And we play in both places where those are useful, so both clinical research, so working with a lot of pharma companies to support measurements in clinical trials for different disease areas, and also in clinical care. We have, I guess, the first approved biomarker by FDA in neurology. We support patients living with epilepsy. We have a product that does real-time detection for seizures and sends alerts, and also it's used by neurologists to review the data and support better patient treatments.
Great, thank you, Matteo. And Bert?
Thank you. So my name is Bert. I'm very happy to be here. Glad that we can be together. I work at Janssen in the clinical innovation team, where we look for capabilities to do clinical research different. And we typically look for proof of value that can lead to new capabilities. So we follow multiple iterations to understand what value we can create. Value is partly for efficiency in research, but mostly, and more relevant for this conference, value is to improve the interaction between patient and clinician. What are the things patients suffer from, hinder patients, debilitates as a result of the disease or the onset of disease, and what decisions does a clinician need to make with those insights, and are those decisions actually relevant for treatment and outcome and what have you. So we try to distinguish between pure science and practical application thereof, and we try to identify these bottlenecks where people experience limitations in their functioning that clinicians may have an opportunity to interact and make decisions on, and see how we can turn that into capabilities that can be applied at the global scale.
Great. And I think what's clear today from the discussions is, the potential is there, but how do we accelerate it now? And maybe, Carrie, to you, in terms of Pfizer having a reputation for accelerated innovation, of course, most recently more than ever before, I guess. How do we accelerate the development in this space?
I think with digital, a lot of this, similar to the previous speaker, requires just people working together. So within Pfizer, we're a large group, so acceleration isn't something that's simple. But we're really working together to try and figure out how to facilitate and implement these into clinical trials, work with regulators, et cetera. Also, we're doing collaborations across companies and others to really push this forward versus going from just exploratory endpoints. Can we make these secondary? What are the arguments and the data needed to bring this together? And doing this just as one isn't necessarily the easiest. So I think earlier in the conference you heard Lucy and others speak about the Nocturnal Scratch Consortium. There's a lot of groups that are coming together, really pushing as a unit how to do this. So I think it's going to take some teamwork as well as just some risk-taking and getting out there and starting to capture these devices, putting them on people, getting the data points, and working together. And that's how we're going to push this forward and continue to push forward and challenge the norm.
Absolutely. And in terms of challenging the norm and I suppose working together to achieve these things, I mean, Ruz, you come from this angle as well. Maybe you can touch a little bit on how, I suppose, from your own work and the industry as a whole is pushing and accelerating this forward.
Yeah, I think accelerated progress is something that as a startup company, you're always pushing fast and hard. And a couple of things that we pay attention to besides getting the regulatory approvals and getting products out. There's just a real need for not just running the studies, but also finding ways to publish and validate the work that's coming out so that our various peers in the literature, you could really see what the results look like compared to the gold standards. That's certainly true for itch detection and analysis, and it's definitely true for our area of focus as well, looking at some of the stress and hydration biomarkers that we're looking at. And that's challenging. It takes time to run these trials and identify the endpoints. What's worked for us at Epicor and just in general on the research side, my experience has been having small companies work with big companies, and then having the hospitals and the researchers like the University of Rochester's of the world and various other places where there's a push to validate. That really becomes a hidden treasure that will ultimately lead to more adoption and hopefully showing data that shows definitively that there is an improvement or outcomes look better. It's a lot of work. It costs a lot. Working with companies like Leo Pharma, Pfizer, the big corporations are really helpful in helping foster that approach, because startup companies as a whole, you can make progress, but having some of the bigger pharma and med tech corporations help facilitate that really reduces the risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matteo, in terms of digital therapeutics, I certainly don't think we can consider that they've had accelerated growth yet, and digital biomarkers is still within its infancy. What do you think are the key things in accelerating this forward, both in your own work at the moment and as a broader industry?
Yeah, no, and I can follow up on what Roosbeth was mentioning, because as a startup company, for example, we initially developed the epilepsy product basically on our own. We went and paid for, nobody, this was 2016, 2015, 2016, it was very early. The sort of awareness about the field was very limited, and so people didn't even believe that you could have such a measure that it could be a proxy to EEG at the clinic. So we basically had to pay sites and run the studies. But I think now many people are realizing that you need collaboration, and I think we saw an excellent example in Diane's talk previously in a consortium approach where you have very big, very large companies, pharma. You have researchers, you have regulatory bodies, you have sensor companies or data companies, and you really need that because it's very complicated and it costs a lot of money. There isn't even today a clear idea in many therapeutic areas on what are the standards. There's no standards. I mean, we know how to detect heart rate, and then we can argue, like what's the clinical validation path depending on the sensor for certain markers, but those are kind of raw ingredients in a sense. Like if you think about digital biomarkers like detecting a seizure or predicting a migraine or forecasting depression, and nobody has any clue today. So the only way to get at, not even the regulators and or the researchers. So I think the only way really is to bring people together, therapeutic area by therapeutic area, and do the hard work. And Roosbeth was mentioning is very hard work, and it might take years to do it properly. Assuming in some cases might not even be possible. You might have to stick with traditional measures. So that's, without the collaboration, which luckily I think now it's been more sort of accepted as a system by different parties, because I guess a lot of companies want to do things in their own little turf and keep their part, and so it's not easy to share. And Diane was saying, we also need to share data. Roosevelt mentioned about the publication. It's very important that this is done collectively.
Yeah, maybe building on that, there's two additional items. One is we need to share the learnings much more aggressively than we've done so far. When a consortium seeks advice from a regulatory body, then that output needs to be shared beyond that consortium. It needs to be made available. It needs to be there for people, maybe in different TAs, different therapeutic areas, to learn from it. And some of these digital measures, they are developed in a disease-specific setting, which is the right approach, but they can be applied across diseases. So when we limit the sharing to within disease only, that hinders progress. So part of the acceleration is to aggressively share what we learn at every step of the way. The other one that was mentioned briefly yesterday, but I didn't hear much follow-up, we need to hit the medical conferences much harder than we've done before. We talk about consortia, we talk about combining tech with research, we talk about patient voice. That's all necessary. In addition, we need to hit the medical conferences where they talk about standards, where they talk about gaps in standards, where they talk about medical practice. That's where we can learn how relevant the problem that we think we're solving actually is, and how much fertile ground there is for adopting the solution that we're developing. And I think that's a missing link, where the digital health scene and the medical scene, they need to learn where to meet and how to connect to each other.
Actually, one topic for Bert, it's sort of like a provocative question. Something I still don't have an answer, because I think on the medical conferences, there's a lot of vested interest, because some of the diagnostics, traditional diagnostics, are very expensive. I can tell you a hospital charges, epilepsy, $10,000 a day for a EEG, video EEG monitoring at a hospital. Our products may be $100 a month. So there's a problem of incentives in traditional industries in moving to some of these new technologies. And so I think that the gap with the traditional medical establishment is still an open point. And how do you handle the disruption when things become suddenly a lot cheaper?
Yeah, but that's I recognize that, so that's absolutely the case. But then the example that I often use is scientific publications that used to be very expensive, very difficult to access without a lot of money. And then open source publications came in and real-time publications came in. And there are downsides, there's pros and cons, but the publishing scene has changed significantly because the world changed. The same needs to happen here. And this elite medical behavior needs to open up, and that's actually happening. Society is asking for democracy in healthcare. The diversity and inclusiveness discussion is here to stay. So I think the opportunity is there, the invitation is there. We just need to accept it and start pushing and start getting those combinations in place to really increase the likelihood of successful adoption.
Thank you.
Fine with you.
I want to second that. I think it's important that we not only discuss the digital aspects of it, but also agree with the medical. I think it's also important, though, that we unify on our language and make sure we're precise in our language and how we talk about things. We've been recently discussing how many different ways digital health technology, medical wearables, sensors, accelerometers, and actigraphy, actimetry. There's so many different words, and we need to be conscious about how we speak about things. Like you mentioned earlier, itch measurement. We're actually measuring scratch instead of itch, and it's a pet peeve of mine. But it's one of those, they're actually words that are commonly interchanged. And that's actually been a challenge in this space because everyone's like, you're measuring itch. Well, actually, itch is a sensation. Scratch is a behavioral response or a movement. That's what we can measure with the devices. So when we go to these medical conferences, we have to be precise in what we're saying, and we also have to go showing data that we can actually do what we say we can do. Because going there and just talking in high levels, the responses I've gotten from physicians thus far is, that's great, now show us that it actually works. And then I think once you can go with that validated data, so not only can we measure something, this is something you can't measure before. It's not just a continuous measurement. This is something new that's going to provide new insight. And not only can we do it, we can do it accurately to this level of precision. That's when you get there. That's where we need to be and be really consistent in that language and bring that data forward.
And Kate, in terms of your own work, I mean, obviously we talk about precise language, is that evolving? Is it developing?
That is correct. So I have to say that actually in terms of this language and ontology which we use in these different domains, there's still some work to be done, but we're getting there thanks for different publications and different sharing and writing, like encyclopedia entries and understanding what's this different keywords we're using and how does it relate to our daily practice and research and what do we understand. But there is still some way of needing to really harmonize how we are defining the specific aspects, and we also have seen it in this conference, yes.
And in terms of the conversation going forward, who needs to be part of this conversation? What groups need to be involved to accelerate this, to push this forward? Who wants to take
Well, I already started a little bit. We've spoken about patient voice is important, and we've seen some nice examples. I think we need to go a step further. We need to actually narrow down on what it is that bothers patients. What is it that hinders limits their functioning, and how can we look for ways to associate that experience with the underlying disease? And then that, in combination with the clinician's ability to actually do something with that insight. That combination of patient insight, clinician decision-making insight, that's missing in many of the conversations. We ask patients like, how do you feel, UX, UI, that's very relevant, but the actual experience and the impact on living their life, and then connected to physicians actually deciding on courses of treatment or similar, that is input that we could learn from. And some of the same use cases we've talked about, augmented with these types of insights, will probably change the dialogue.
I would like to add to this that in our research,
Go ahead, Kate.
in our research, we are leveraging mixed method approaches in longitudinal settings where we have not just the wearable, but I could see that our everybody has some wearable, right? So we're all testing our devices. Myself also, you could see I had a continuous glucose monitor because I'm preparing for working with type 2 diabetes patients. Also checking ourselves what's the burden behind these different protocols and understanding the type of data coming in. So really I would, as you want to have a professor on panel, now we have a homework. We are all going to act as the patients in our trials and also get into the shoes. And what's meaningful for patients, we may not see the specific symptoms and functioning impairment, but like at least like what's the protocol like and how would that be to fill up this questionnaire a few times a day or answering the psychological momentary assessment. In our protocols, we also involve involuntary caregivers, family, friends around the patients in which the persons are having so-called peer momentary assessment. So it's observer or proxy around the patients who are also filling up daily assessments. So really getting into what's meaningful to the patients and how do they understand their condition. And I will just give you one quote from the patients, which the person told me, I just want to get my life back. I don't want to even talk to you, right? So I was their very critical point of view, like I don't need your devices. I don't want that the device reminds me I'm sick. That's another quote from the patient. So we need to be very careful in understanding what are the methods we're involving and what's the burden. And I'll be very happy to advise you if you need from the methodological perspective. Thank you.
And Ruz, back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add a little bit. From our experience, having the patient input and engaging with them at an early, even during the development phase at an early time has made a world of difference. I'll use an example. Some of the work that we ran at Northwestern looking at some of these wearable sensors for tracking biomarkers in cystic fibrosis patients. So looking at chloride in particular in sweat. Having the feasibility studies run was, one key milestone, but also surveying the parents, the caregivers early on so that we could not just get feedback on the results, but also how we develop the tool earlier rather than building it and then getting data and then engaging with the. It made the world of difference for us to figure out what are the pain points for the patients early on while we were developing the tool. That may save you time as well as just the amount of time and dollars that would go into having to redo your software, redo your analytics per what is most suitable for your main customer. In this case, it's the patient. So I strongly feel that, and it's certainly something that we learned experientially, having done it a couple of times with different devices.
I want to say this can't be done in a silo. We tend to do things that, here's my data scientists, here's my patients, we do. I personally feel that putting everybody in a room, the patients, the physicians, operations, your data architects, your data scientists, your data managers, everyone in one room to have these discussions. A simple example is we wanted to have a patient mail a device back in. When they were done, just stick it in an envelope, mail it. I'm thinking this is going to be so simple. Stick a stamp in it, let's follow it. It took, I think, over 9 months. I don't want to talk about how many different phone calls when you deal with multiple countries. It's not as simple as sticking a stamp on something and sending it.
And I think that brings it back to the frictionless, and to the point that you made earlier, Bert, around this, looking at the user experience, and putting a stamp on something is not actually that simple. Is there anything we can learn from other industries that really look to frictionless user experience that we might be able to apply here? I mean, all of you are innovators in your own right. What is it that you're looking to other industries that might apply here for acceleration of growth?
So I can share one example that I still find very interesting, and that's the automobile industry, where the cars we drive today assuming the necessity to drive is still there. So let's go with that kind of isolating a transportation method. The cars look very different from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, from 30 years ago. But nobody has been trained on using these new cars the way they're presented to you. There's all sorts of features and gadgets in there. There may be a manual, more likely than not there isn't. But somehow we figure out how it works. And that's not because we understand the coloring of the wiring coming out of some of these gadgets. That's not because we understand what it actually is that we see happen under the hood, or we hear happen under the hood. Somehow the manufacturer figured out how to make it work in a way that is so easy for people to make use of, that there's distance between manufacturing detail and safety controls and all the regulations, because these automobile manufacturers are subject to very stringent regulations to do with safety, etc. As a driver, you don't really see much of that, you don't really experience much of that. There's been test drives with people, like crash dummies, but also real people. But you, as a general member of the public, you just jump in and you start driving and it works. That's the mindset we need to strive for. And I know that's a little bit different from healthcare, but there are so many similarities where all that stuff under the hood for us developing solutions in healthcare is super relevant. For patients, it should be seamless, it should be completely predictable, it should not be something they have to think about.
It's a tough question, because you know the instinct, I think, in a lot of digital healthcare, and we see some of the less egregious examples in the past years, is that we should copy technology. It moves fast, we experiment, we do things. That doesn't work very well. In healthcare, it does not work very well. As we've seen, maybe we see dramatized some of the worst examples. But I think it's important to recognize that healthcare is a regulated industry, as Bert was mentioning, and so you need to consider that, because it's a considerable part of the work that you have to do. You have to include regulations, certifications, keeping standards. And keeping standards means you have to do things appropriately. You have to ensure quality. It means a lot of procedures. And so that usually tends to slow things down. And so I think the question is, like, how do you keep moving as fast as possible while doing things at the best quality that you can get? And that's really tough. I think, at least for us, we, of course, in terms of the design and the patient-centric approach, we look at the best cases. Technology, there's a lot, but for accelerating the deployment of those products, we try to look at, like aerospace, automotive is one, even finance, and so try to separate what are the things that you can change fast because they don't put any safety, security, or patient engagement risks, and so you can sort of experiment without going to the regulators. But then other things you need to be very careful, like the way you design your clinical trial, the way you develop the product, the manufacturing procedures. You have to be very deliberate in making sure that it's not going to touch, like in a way that could affect patients in any way. And so it's kind of keeping pockets of fast-growing, fast-moving innovation while keeping extreme high quality. And that's, I think that's more difficult than in other industries where nobody's going to check if you're, like, your deployment procedures for algorithms, like how are they going to track? We saw what happened with Apple when some research had to be reviewed because the data changed in the product because they updated the algorithm because it's not a medical device, they can do whatever they want, and that's a challenge in healthcare. And so it's not, I think inspiration can come in different ways, but we need to be very deliberate on what we look at, what industry for what part of the stack. So, like, is this regulated or you can be experimenting?
I have an example quickly, which has been mentioned previously, and actually it's closer to home. Let's say polysonography, if I understand correctly. At the beginning, there was some set of colleagues, experts, professors. I actually don't know who was in the room. There was some kind of workshop at which 3 days they were debating, and at the end they came up into conclusion what needs to be measured for sleep. And then what do we have right now? Okay, I'm not an expert again, but it was what we have a reimbursement code, we have a diagnostic value, right? And there is a progress there, and there is a specific set of standards and specific training necessary, and somehow, again, maybe somebody else is familiar with this, closer to home, with respect to the fact that it's something which happened in the medical field, and so there's a hope there, and there's some learning, and maybe it's a matter of really setting up a specific set of standards, internal, de facto, and then following this. And the next good thing would be that in some years, FDA calls for a specific concept of interest and maybe outcomes and the endpoints from us, and specific digital biomarker like for sleep duration or physical functioning is called for all the digital for clinical trials or other aspects. So, yeah.
Anything to add there online? So in terms of, we've looked at other industries, we've looked at digital biomarkers and digital assessments. Conversations have been had today, questions have been asked, answered, and more questions posed, right? What do we think of the topics we're going to maybe have understood a little bit more at the next Digital Biomarkers, Digital Measures conference? And what are the questions we may still be asking?
So maybe let me start. Two things. One, I think we need to start looking at services to be provided to this ecosystem. Working together is one thing, but that is a group of specialists, farm, medtech, startup, others, creating a consortium. But there are commodity items in there. Running clinical trials, I would argue as a startup, you probably don't want to do yourself. You probably want to make use of a service industry that's called CROs, where they run clinical trials as a business. So there's an opportunity to partner. Maintaining data sets, related activities to maintaining the stack that makes up a digital measurement solution can probably be commoditized in some shape or form. So part of scaling has to be commoditizing elements of the ecosystem we're working on. I don't see that happen yet. I see a lot of specialty approaches, which is good. I see consortium, which is good, but I don't see commoditizing yet. I think that's a missing next generation item. And I think the other one is that we need to start looking for broad-based measurement solutions, like the nighttime stretching, which is atopic dermatitis, but is not limited to atopic dermatitis. It can be applied many times in different disease areas. So we need to look for other examples that span across diseases. We sort of know how to develop a measurement solution for a specific disease, so we can start replicating, becoming more efficient at doing so. We need to start looking across, like heart rate, blood pressure. No physician would claim that that's unique to one particular disease. It's very generic, and it can be applied to specific diseases with specific use cases. We need some more of those examples to really push solutions into healthcare and to really get the attention of physicians. When it's too much niche only, you're never going to reach all the physicians. So we have to find some of these broad cases to really allow this integration between digital health and like medicine, and then the niche examples will follow alongside.
I will just follow that. I will take a step back and say that most of the learning which we see from all the talks is to work with patients and with other stakeholders and not for them, or do something with them. From the beginning with them and not for them later after the fact. And also, if I hear correctly from other colleagues, was involving the payers, the providers, other stakeholders really with them and not for them or informing them afterwards.
So in terms of these discussions, we've talked about, what the new kind of questions will be asked, but what advice do you give to the audience here who clearly we're all passionate about innovation? What advice do you give them in terms of accelerating this growth between now and, say, next year's conference?
I'll try one.
I'll start. Um,
Oh,
We go on, yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Carrie.
Carrie,
Yeah, go
Carrie.
ahead, Carrie.
I was just saying, we're in a really exciting time right now. This is really a new field. Um, we're developing, and I agree with that earlier sentiment, we're really developing new tools for a toolbox that we can apply to a lot of different fields in a lot of different ways. And I think we're having the right conversations, and I'm excited to see where we're going to be in a year, how we're applying these new tools. We're talking about gait, we're talking about scratch, we're talking about sleep, we're talking about measures of seizures, all these heart rate, all these different types of things. And I think what we're going to see in this next year is really some application of this and really demonstrating some of the value of these new tools for the toolbox. I think we spent a lot of time in the last several years, listening to patients, hopefully talking to them, physicians, et cetera, and we're developing these tools. Now we're going to see them applied, and hopefully we're going to start to be able to look at some of the benefits and outcomes.
I'll
Yeah,
carry
go
forward
first.
what
Yeah,
Carrie
yeah.
was mentioning. I was going to say actually something similar. I think it's important to focus on the value, because the fact that we can measure something doesn't mean that it's important or that anybody cares. It's just something that might be interesting. But what is it going to be for the industry, for payers, for patients, for clinicians? I think the focus needs to be squarely on the value. And when you start prioritizing that, I think you realize that you have to be ready to do the hard work. So that would be my advice. If you look at the value and you want to bring real value, it's tough. And so I would avoid sort of like shortcuts in getting something that's kind of works, but then when people are going to ask what is the value, you don't have any data to back it up. And so it might be better paradoxically to maybe not, we don't have an answer next year, we have it in 3 years. But in 3 years, you have a real product, something that a regulator would approve, that payers will reimburse for, the clinicians will use. I mean, maybe they'll take them some time, but still, they'll be there. So I think the focus on the value makes a huge difference from developing a minimum viable product, which is a great concept from technology, but in healthcare, it's debatable if it's usable.
Maybe the other thing is to really look for help. Along the way, everybody is going to face challenges, face very difficult problems. Chances are you're not the first to face that problem or that challenge. So we need to be very much more communicative on some of the challenges we face to allow others who've been there before to help. And we need to communicate once we've learned what we've learned, so it becomes part of the public domain. So you can search for it, and that sharing lessons learned, seeking, reaching out for help, in the spirit of where do you want to be competitive and where do you want to be transparent and really open. That is one that needs to evolve. I don't think there are many problems that nobody has solved yet. There's always somebody who has experience on something similar to what you're trying to solve. It's a matter of finding the right balance between investing in time, finding that someone or that organization or that, etc., versus going your own and learning the hard way. But I think we can make improvements there.
I'm conscious.
Just
Yeah, go
maybe
ahead.
to add one additional thought as we think about next year and beyond, building off of what Carrie mentioned about the toolkit. What we're starting to see on maybe the earlier research side of things is a convergence of different sensing tools coming together. And we've seen heart rate. Matteo mentioned electrodermal activity, and blood pressure is starting to come out. I think what may start to happen is we've been in sort of this transition period, getting a lot of different sensor data coming in. There's already this convergence happening around what if we take continuous glucose monitor and look at different ketones and your glucose, and then look at your heart rate and blood pressure all at the same time. And a lot of these may lead to dead ends, but then some may lead to some interesting insights. And that's something on the research side I think we're going to continue to see more of. So it's not just let's measure heart rate or HRV for thousands of patients, but let's start to see where there is some type of correlations, but then will that actually lead to new changes? So the research sphere and publications are starting to reflect some of that. It's earlier, but interesting. And just one note there, I think the data scientists and the folks in the room who are leading a lot of the charge there can help direct some of the sensor development and the value of the toolkit, because you don't want to develop things that are not ultimately going to affect value, like Matteo and others have said. So that's something, in this broad, wave of innovation and things, it is a really exciting time. It's something we're starting to see happen. And, it's not all that surprising that, you have all this miniaturization of devices that you're able to wear on different parts of the body, but no one wants to do studies that don't lead to high impact. And so now that we have the tools, to Carrie's point, how are we going to be able to make sense and start to pinpoint various markers that could rely on multiple sensors and not the traditional ones? So that's something we're seeing. I think that's going to continue on next year, I think, and even beyond that. So something that is very exciting and somewhat unknown as things unfold.
I'm conscious a lot of you are staying over time here, so do we have time for at least one question from the audience? Okay, good. So just to give you an opportunity if anyone has any questions for our panelists. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Raise my voice. Anders from Sony.
Sorry.
So talk quite a bit about sensors and these type of technologies. How about more holistic data like air quality, air pressure, all these kind of things that you typically don't measure on you, that you typically have around you? Where do they come into this more kind of digital biomarker concept?
Absolutely. I'll may just start. As I moved to Geneva in 2020, I started to realize there's geographic information system describing every single building in Geneva, every tree and the bench and the garbage bin. And we're incorporating this in one of the research for quality of life assessment in Geneva, like where you live, what's the quality of your housing, and besides what you say, what's the objective, what the government knows about you, in a sense. So very important. Thank you.
I think where you're going is like next generation healthcare, where we need these holistic insights. The difficulty in more of a business environment is that the effects resulting from these external factors often take decades to present themselves. So for research studies to understand what you see and correlate to environmental data, that takes a very long time. So that is a plea for public investment in the space to start building normative data, to start understanding correlations, and then over time, as we develop insights, we can see to what extent we can action on these insights and where possible prevent or where necessary react. But there's going to be a need for, I think, a public investment in just understanding what the world looks like in that regard, and build up that normative data set to use as a backdrop. It can't start soon enough.
A simple thing like migraine, like we talked about Matteo, but the air pressure or just having a thunderstorm nearby would maybe be good indication if that is a possible cause of the onset of migraine.
Yeah, I would have done the same example because that's an established measurement in migraine. The problem is, but my view, which is very, very pragmatic, is how do you go to FDA and convince them? That's my, my personal challenge today, because I think the research is extremely fascinating because we know that contextual information is extremely important, and even sunlight or air quality on, asthma patients. But how do you sort of control that in a strict clinical validation environment? That's really tough. And as Bert was saying, we kind of don't have the answer for some of the things, or we don't know how to control for them. And so, and the FDA would say, yeah, nice try, and come back with something else. And so that's, I think, the challenge between kind of how do we establish new research, which is sort of like a public good sort of investment, as we were mentioning, and okay, how do you get a product approved, are two different challenges today.
Thank you. We have one question from our online audience, from Neil Newman, who says, if you could remove one barrier to increase pre-competitive collaboration, what would it be?
I would say access to data, and control of data is seen as a very important good, and it is in many regards, but it also limits and it results in replication of data sets. So I think we need to understand where data really needs to be controlled by single entities versus data available in the public domain, maybe with some controls, but there's a lot of opportunity for reducing the redundancy in data sets.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate it. What another great conversation. We moved the dial forward again, so thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So it's up to me to close this up. Thank you all for joining. I have a summary of notes from today, which I won't delay you any further by going through, but I'm sure you've all taken so many notes and findings from today. I remember when I finished my PhD, I said to my supervisor, I know less now than I did when I started, because I knew so much more about what I didn't know than I did when I was a cocky student going into it. I feel a little bit the same today. We answered questions, but we asked as many of unanswered ones, and I hope the next time we meet, we'll have some of these questions answered and more to answer again. Thank you so much for joining us, and safe trip home.